Good Tuesday to you, everybody in Com 710. Welcome to week, boom, 8. How you doing? Tuesday, February 28th, coming up on modular week, spring break week, in which you get a little bit of a breather. Okay, so until then, stay charged and caffeinated as I do. Okay, well, welcome everybody again. Week 8, 1 week out from spring break. A couple of announcements here before we take a look at your readings and your answers to the questions from last week. As of really yesterday, your papers are all graded and posted in Blackboard. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. If I have a note in your paper which says, hey, let's talk about this, please respond or reach out to me. Whichever, or whatever feedback and comments you got. First and foremost, remember what we're doing in this exercise. That is, this is a chance for me to give you some feedback, and in doing so, for you to take that feedback and change it. Do more of what I say. Yeah, do this, and do less of what I point out. Say, don't do that. Okay. So, a couple of things. First, you may notice that there are pages in which I haven't made any remarks, any comments. All right. I'm not saying that there aren't any issues on those pages. What I'm looking for are patterns. Do you follow APA formatting? Is your grammar and punctuation where it needs to be? These things. And so when you see those in the first 2 or 3 pages, the message here to you is fix that throughout all of the paper. Okay, so please, keep an eye for that as you go through and read my comments, that they're meant to be not just for that specific spot, because the way Blackboard works as a suite, a place where I grade papers, it only lets me highlight specific text, and then only certain text. So I might have highlighted, for instance, the word introduction, and then said something about everything else that came in the introduction. All right, and that's because for some reason it's just kind of glitchy. Sometimes it will let me highlight whatever I want, and sometimes it won't. All right, I find it frustrating as a tool. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. Secondly, also remember as part of the feedback and the dialogue, the developmental process with your writing in your paper. Part of what we're doing here is, if you take the remarks that I give you, and if you correct them in the 3 sections that you've written, and some of you, let me just say as an aside, need to write more. I mean, you turn into what was really draft work, and this is not meant to be draft work. Okay, so if you take the corrections that I gave you in the 3 sections that you've already written, or that you need to write more fully, you take those corrections, you make the corrections in that section, you correct the tendency in the remainder of the paper, the 2 last sections. When you turn in the final paper at the end of the semester, if your score goes up on the final paper, I will raise your score on this first part to equal that. So let's say you got a 75 on this effort. If your score goes up to a 95, I go back and change the 75 to a 95. Because the point here is to get you to think about your writing as a process, something that's dynamic, something that you need to look at and change and go, oh, okay, yeah, I could see it like that, and I can do it like this. Okay, so if you didn't get a score that you were hoping for, fear not. Make the changes that I recommend. Do more of the things that I say. Yeah, this is good. Do less of the stuff that I go, don't do that for the final paper, and this will change your scores. Okay. And then finally, I've given this some thought, and even with a crazy schedule, I am going to schedule, and maybe you do it during modular week or maybe on the other side of modular week. I'm going to schedule a Zoom session for it's just, open to anybody who wants to attend, in which we're going to go through um, some big picture items and then some specific things that will help you write stronger academic works, whether it's papers or journal articles or conference proposals, all of these things. Okay, because there are patterns that emerge and things that are going well, and patterns that emerge in things that aren't so going well. And I'll sit down in the Zoom, and probably split it, and I'll just do half of them. Let me present some of, I don't know, top 5 items or something like that, and then we'll open it up for discussion. All right, and if that's a benefit to you, then that'll make me happy. All right, because that's what we want to do here. Okay, coming probably by tomorrow. I would have had it for you yesterday. I've just been swamped. I will give out to you your second class presentation. Okay, now remember, unless you make specific arrangements with me for specific reasons, I need you to do an oral presentation, that is, in which you're speaking, you're summarizing these chapters, you're giving what the author is up to and all that stuff, and I need you to use YouTube. Why am I getting paid by YouTube? No, I am not. But in a class that whose focus is communication in a global environment, it behooves you to have an operational understanding of one of the most common, if not the most common, global communication platforms. Maybe Twitter is up there, but I don't see how you could tweet a response to a chapter. Maybe you would like that. I loved it. Best chapter ever. So you get the point. You understand what I mean. Okay. So watch for the chapter assignments coming soon this week. And, you can sort of chew on them over modular week, and then we'll have them do the week or so after that. Okay, let's take a look at the questions from last week and some of your responses, see what we can add. We read a lot of Thusis this last week, and so that's where most of our questions are focused. Question number 1, what does Thusis argue? Why, does Thusis argue for a transcultural approach to comparative media research? Okay, Anthony, let's see what you're up to here. Thusis argues for a transcultural approach to comparative media research because he discovered a gap created by a parochial manner previous studies approached. Try to turn those words around so we don't, it's just a little kind of backwards. Sounds like you're speaking German. And discussed media and communication studies in a globally mediated and connected world. He saw the growing institutionalization of students and researchers. This is called for innovative research methodology, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, down to your second paragraph. I think this is where it really gets interesting. This need is premised on the unprecedented growth of media in non-Western worlds, such as China and India. Despite this extraordinary expansion in the field within higher education, media studies remains largely a nationally bound and inward-looking area of academic inquiry. And that's true. And Thusis has all sorts of nasties lurking under the bed that is reasons for why this is. If you go, and I encourage you to get a copy of Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat. And, you can get it in Kindle for like $10 or something like that. Okay. Take a look at the arguments that Friedman lays out as to why the communication landscape was flattened out, that his barriers were removed in the late 20th century. And then think about the landscape in the, we're now in the first quarter of the 21st century. Yeah, it's 2023. We're really coming up on it. Okay. And ask yourself if the model of a flat communication landscape, it still holds, really true. So, for example, and I'm not giving you an answer here. I'm inviting you to take a look at it. Okay. So, someone like Friedman would argue that certain technologies like internet browsers allow everybody to access the material that's on the World Wide Web. Great. This disseminates information. Okay. On the other hand, do cultures disseminate information fluidly back and forth between each other? So you could say, for instance, there's a video and it's gone viral and everybody's watching it. Okay, fantastic. How many viral videos created in China, in Chinese, for a Chinese audience, have you seen lately? Because I haven't seen any. So there are these barriers that the tools that we now use in the international landscape have not flattened out, and in some instances have actually grown the height of the barrier between cultures, these little pockets that are there. So, okay, transcultural approach is necessary. I don't disagree. All right. Things were flattened out. Okay. And the question is, are they still as flat as Friedman said they were, or are there barriers? And if there are barriers, what are they? And this is perhaps where I part ways with Thusis. I believe that the barriers are created by an amplification of a culture's awareness of itself. And we'll get to this later in the questions. So, in other words, China and India, or let's just look at China. China, through these technological tools, which were invented in the West, has developed a deepening sense of its own culture and its own place in the world. And as the article on consumer trends in China points out to you, so much so, that is this development of a sense of self, that the economic trend is swinging hard and significantly in China in the direction of buy made in China. China has for many, many years, centuries really, been a consumer. The goods it consumed were primarily produced externally. That's changing. The preference is changing for goods produced in the nation, internally. So, yes, transcultural approach, that's good. What's driving some of the separation of cultures now in the world? Is it because of a hyper Western focus? Or is it because these cultures are developing, excuse me, I just whacked my desk. These cultures are developing a deeper awareness of themselves and are separating from each other. Okay. So, I wanted you, and by the way, and we're going to get to it here in a question, I want you to be critical of the sources that you read. Just because it's in print and it's assigned doesn't mean that it still holds true. And it's all right, for you as a reader to be critical. Okay, let's take a look at question number 2. Explain what Hemp and Caudry mean by container thinking and cultural thickening. Do you agree or disagree with their diagnosis of the problem and their prescribed solution? Okay. Shonda, let's see what you're up to here. According to Thusis, container thinking within social theory has 3 parts. First, it critiques the container concept of the state, rejecting thinking of the nation state as something like the reservoir of society. Okay, so that's really at the heart of it. There's this idea that the nation state is the society. And if you go back into the 20th century, this was certainly the dominant train of thought among peoples, primarily Western, but in some instances, very much non-Western. This was at the heart of the Communist Revolution, the Maoist Revolution in China. That is, that the culture or the people was the state. You know, you'll hear people rail on and grind their teeth about Nazis, and we're not going to have any more. And they point fingers, both from the left and the right side of the political spectrum as to who's the Nazi. Okay. Well, one of the fundamental underlying principles, tenets of Nazism, National Socialism, was that the individual primarily found meaning for his or herself through his or her relationship and subordination to the state. So unless you have someone running around saying, the state gets to define who you are and you find meaning by attaching yourself to state pushed trends and code of behavior, the label of Nazi, at least in that respect, really doesn't fit. Okay, so yeah, this is what container thinking is. Okay, second, let's continue with your answer here, Chandra. It critiques thinking that the nation state is territorialized, that is, national cultures are unquestionably related to defined living territories or borders. And that is also a good observation. That's the other change. That as people connect with each other within this electronic space and across physical boundaries, they're changing of how they think of themselves and one another. I mean, first and foremost, let's recognize that the concept of a border is the concept of an artificial barrier. I mean, there are no lines on the ground that correspond to the lines on the map. So there's a artificiality that we impose on our conceptualization of space. Well, when you have a medium, digital media, and say, social media, places on the World Wide Web, where you can meet, that sort of fixed conceptualization of physical barriers begins to dissolve away. And it's true that people are thinking of themselves less and less in terms of their identity as living within a defined territory than they were before. Okay, good answer. Okay, let's take a look at question number 3. Consider how Thusis concludes chapter 1. There is a moral imperative to internationalize media studies. What does Thusis mean by this? Do you agree or disagree with the author's conclusion? Support your answer with at least one scholarly source. Okay. When I see language like moral imperative, that always sort of perks me up. I'm like, oh, really? That's pretty strong. That's pretty strong. Not this is an area that's been neglected and therefore it needs study. This is something that the communication professional needs to know because the world is becoming globalized. No. Moral imperative. Well, that's pretty strong language. All right, Marquette, let's see what you said. The availability of new digital technologies and open source material can further the cause of greater media literacy. All right, fair enough. For this to happen, there is a need to foster institutional and individual intellectual links across various disciplines and undertake grounded research that questions old paradigms and provides material for new theorization. I don't necessarily agree with you there. I don't know that you need to challenge this, that, or the other to move things forward. I mean, even say open source. This is not a new concept to the 21st century. And this is a good answer, Mark. And I'm not taking in after you. Communalism, whether it's a physical space like a field or a non-physical product like, some chunk of software, the idea that somebody creates something and then it's there and everybody uses it, that's old. Okay. No new paradigms here. For this to happen, there needs to be a foster new research. Okay, undertake ground research that questions old paradigms, provides material for new theories. However, internationalization is not without many impediments. The impediments apart, there is a moral imperative to internationalize. In a period of globalization, the media could promote to the creation of a second could be promoted, could be elevated to a second superpower, world public opinion. However, with the rapid privatization of means of communication, media, and the promotion of global consumerist culture predicated on the supremacy of the market, the public aspect of the media are under constant threat. Okay. All right, let's focus on your thoughts on the public access to media and media space, because I think you're right. And I think this is one of the areas that is getting ready to again undergo a disruption. And I'll explain here in just a second. The digital space was conceived and designed explicitly. I mean, one of the reasons that it was put up and put out there was to allow a space in which individuals could freely communicate, and I mean openly and without cost. All right. That is not disappearing, but it's evolving rapidly. Many information sources, newspapers and magazines or things are now behind paywalls. Certain platforms like Twitter have a paid component. I mean, there's a free component, but then there if you want some of the perks, like the blue check verification, you have to pay. Okay. So this is not an open and free space, and it's certainly not a free space in the sense that it's a space for free exchange of ideas when you have someone's account being shut down and then they're kicked off of the platform, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or whatever, Instagram. And so that's a problem. All right. That's a problem that needs to be addressed. Could media be elevated to the point of a superpower? Well, I mean, there are indicators that this is a problematic shift that we've undergone in the last decade as well, in which we now have strong indicators that certain media platforms, Google, Facebook, what do you see when you search what's allowed on platforms like Facebook, Twitter, favor certain narratives, persons, and political parties. That's like saying, the public space closes off if you identify with a certain group, or amplifies and exaggerates the size of a crowd if you're there for a gathering with a certain group. Okay. Here's what I mean when I say there's another disruptor coming. In the content creation area, whether that's flat out media, music, digital art, voice over, that artificial intelligence is now being pushed into that space and generating that content where before it was generated by people. Likewise, the code that runs everything, artificial intelligence is pushing into that space. And there are now artificial intelligence available, on the internet that allow you, if you need a chunk of code written and you don't know anything about coding, you can interface with the AI in plain language, saying, "How do I make this text appear blue?" ? And the artificial intelligence behind the site will give you the source code, the HTTP, that the computer reads to create the image that's seen on the screen. All right. The question is, and this is where the direction of the disruption is going to go. Will there be a substantive core of these AI sites available to the public without charge, or will they be locked behind paywalls, like we're seeing with information, locked behind paywalls? And so only certain people will be able to access AI that generates content, generates code. It's going to be interesting to see. All right, Brenda, let's see what you had to say about this. I agree with Thusis on the importance of internationalizing media studies purely from the standpoint of understanding how media and communication studies impact and help address unique challenges faced by other cultures. But this approach should not focus on de-Westernizing media studies that has a negative connotation, as Thusis warns, but to identify differences and similarities through the comparative and collaborative research to draw best practices of both critical and liberal traditions of media communication scholarship, which demands thinking beyond the idea of West versus the rest and de-Westernization. And I think that is such an excellent point. There's a certain irony in the communication space about this sometimes loud and louder than other times drumming that we hear about de-Westernizing things, that this is happening in a space that was that is a product of a very Western conceptualization of the world. Look, in general, cultures that are flexible and absorb ideas and practices from other cultures do well. Because, remember that a culture is not a vase, it's not a painting, it's not a food, it's not a costume. These are artifacts of culture. All right. It's not the culture itself. Culture itself, the heart of what it is, it's a series of behaviors that allows a certain people to adapt to a certain set of conditions at a certain place and time. And since conditions and places and time are always changing, the adaptivity has to change, or the people don't survive or thrive. And that's not a commentary on this culture versus that culture. That's a statement of what the whole stuff is for. Okay. One of the advantages that Western culture has as a system of practices, it's extremely flexible and it's absorbative. It just sucks in stuff from and I mean, even without a second thought. And this is reflected, we can see this as communicators in the language, right? The dominant language of Western culture is English, right? That's at the top. And English as a language is tremendously flexible, both in terms of its grammar and in its adoption of other words. And I have spent large chunks of time in cultures that are not flexible, and linguistically, they just tie themselves into knots. So, Arabic is a language that's not tremendously flexible in its own way. On a sort of on a higher intellectual level, French is not tremendously flexible. Within the nation of France, there's a ministry, there's a branch of the government whose job it is to give francophonic names to things that they don't have names for, and the result is just a mouthful. So, for instance, if the officially in France, if you're a vendor and you want to sell blue jeans, all right, officially, you're not allowed to use the English language, the English adaptation, blue jeans. You have to say les pantalons, pants, de trois bleus, the twill color blue. Now, the interesting thing is that at this upper level, this very rigid level, they say no. You can't, if you're selling this item or if you're advertising out in the public space, you can't say hot dog. You have to say saucisson de Genève, a Genevan sausage. But down at the sort of the cultural level, the intercourse with people, people moving back and forth, nobody says Genevan sausage or twill blue pants. They say hot dog and blue jeans. So there's this disconnect, okay? But cultures that are flexible and slurp up things from other cultures do well. So it's sort of, I see this West versus the non-West dichotomy when it comes up, and I sort of wonder, okay, what are we really up to here as a thinker? All right, question number 4. I gave you a quote from Thucydides, and I asked you to answer a few questions. Both societies, and here we're talking about India and China, have formidable differences in their capitalistic paths. Their capitalistic paths have taken distinct trajectories. They also show compelling common elements, including a culture of thrift, of repair and recycling, in sharp contrast to the profligate, consumerist, and ultimately unsustainable cultures of the dominant West. Okay, so what societies are referring to? Do you agree? And then I wanted you to read something from the McKinsey Institute about consumer trends in China. Okay, now I'll tell you right now, the reason for this question is I wanted you to question the source. Okay, Marquette, in the text, when Thucydides refers to societies referring to China and India, limitations of the study of the media, which is necessary in part by increasing. After reviewing the text, I would have to agree with Thucydides. It argues the limitations strengthen their culture and how they move in the economic world as well. Okay, I'm going to disagree with you. All right. The reason that I gave you that McKinsey Institute report, and I think one of the lines in there that sort of sums up what they're talking about in regards to the Chinese consumer is that they, quote, tend to punch above their weight. Well, what does that mean? That means they're spending into a higher bracket than they earn. This is not a culture that is focused on, centered on, connected to, and revolves around recycling and reuse, and moves away from conspicuous consumerism. In fact, it's just the opposite. It's just the opposite. Lauren, let's look at what you say. Let me first openly admit that I am not an economic expert. Okay, you don't have to be. And my mind was a little lost in both this text and the link reading. However, Thucydides was referring to China and India. I don't know that I do agree with their assessment that these countries share a culture of thrift. As a second reading pointed out, that over a decade, China may add more consumption than any other country and is expected to generate more than 1/4 of all global consumption goods. Correct. So this is not a country geared towards bottlenecking, putting the brakes on consumerism as a step away from or in contrast to, or whatever the language you like, Western consumption-oriented capitalism. Just the opposite. Okay, everybody, that is it. We're at the about the half-hour mark. Remember to be critical of the sources that you read. Just because it's a sign and just because it's in print doesn't mean that it's correct. Doesn't mean that the author got it right. And you should you should, always sort of be stroking your chin going, yeah, that's not what I remember. And then, go out and pop open a source and take a look at what's out there. Maybe your hunch is right, or maybe it's sort of like, oh yeah, okay, I've forgotten about this. And you get that sort of straightened out in your head. It's like listening to a song and you hear a lyric in there and you're not quite sure what the lyric is. And the years go on and on and on. And one day you just had it. You just say, okay, what in the bloody world is that person saying in that little? And then you look it up. Okay. Something like that. Okay, everybody. Again, if you have any questions about comments from papers, please reach out to me. I have Monday, Wednesday, Friday office hours, noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that's a good time to reach me. If you call and I don't pick up, that just means I am on the line with somebody else. Leave a message and I'll call you back, or just text me at that number. All right, everybody. Thank you so very, very much. God bless you. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you on Blackboard. Bye-bye.